Hello, I am Anshuman Bora, and I welcome you to the second week of MOOC on oral history. Today we'll discuss on a topic emphasizing indigenous narratives and storytelling. We'll focus on the voices which have long existed outside the written documents and archival records. The voices of the indigenous communities who have preserved the past not through writing, but through narrative, performance, and memory. When we hear the word storytelling, we think of myths, folk tales, or cultural traditions, which are meant for entertainment. However, for many communities around the world, especially in regions like Northeast India, storytelling is not only entertainment, it is a historical act. It's a way of remembering the past, understanding the present, and guiding the future. The indigenous narratives carry knowledge about migration, kinship, resistance, ecology, spirituality, identity, and law. They encode collective memory, moral values, and social organization and link generations together through oral transmission like songs, chants, proverbs, epic tales, and ritual performances. These narratives are not based on detached observation, they're based on lived experience and communal participation. They're dynamic, emotional, and embodied, and change with context and audience, reflecting the living nature of indigenous history. For a long time, these forms of knowledge were dismissed by conventional historians as unscientific or unreliable and labeled as myth, folklore, or legend. Thus, they were excluded from the formal discipline of history. But as scholars like Jean Vansina, Alessandro Portelli, and L.T. Smith have shown us, these narratives contain certain valuable historical truths. These are not just factual truths, they are emotional and cultural truths, which the written archives often fail to capture. To emphasize indigenous narratives is therefore to rethink what counts as history. It's to accept that the past can be recorded in sound, movement, memory, and space, not only in text. It is to recognize that every community has a history, and even if it's not written in the books or preserved in archives. In this lecture, we'll examine the indigenous narratives and storytelling as an alternative but powerful form of historiography. We'll explore how the oral traditions have functioned as repositories of knowledge, how they differ from the written history, and how they challenge the dominance of conventional frameworks. We'll discuss storytelling as a form of resistance and decolonization, where communities have used the narrative to preserve identity, assert agency, and correct historical misrepresentation. Ultimately, emphasizing indigenous narratives is not about adding new sources to history. It is about embracing a more inclusive, ethical, and relational understanding of knowledge itself. To truly understand and appreciate indigenous narratives and storytelling, we first have to see the worldview from which they emerge. Indigenous knowledge systems are not simply alternative sources of information. They represent an entirely different way of knowing, remembering, and relating to the past. In many indigenous societies, knowledge is not owned by individuals, rather, it is held collectively by the community. The memory is shared, preserved, and transmitted across generations through oral traditions, rituals, and collective performances. A story is not just told, it is experienced together. It may only be narrated in a specific season, in a particular place, or by a designated elder or storyteller, which ensures accuracy, continuity, and cultural responsibility. Thus, indigenous history is not about private authorship, it's about communal custodianship. In conventional history, the archives are seen as fixed and unchanging. But in the context of the indigenous communities, memory is alive. Every retelling of the story is adapted to the audience, to the moment, and to the purpose. This does not make it less true. Rather, it makes it more relevant and meaningful to the present community. As Alessandro Portelli had argued, oral narratives capture not just what happened, but what the event meant to the people who experienced it. Memory, then, is not simply data, it is understanding. In many of the the indigenous cultures, knowledge is expressed not through words but through performances like songs, chants, dances, gestures, and ritual movements. The tone of the voice, the rhythm of the drum, the setting of the ritual, every element communicate a meaning and provide emotional and spiritual context which cannot be captured by written text. For example, a war song which is performed by a community is not a narrative of conflict. It is a performance of memory, pride, and collective identity. Thus, to read indigenous history, we must learn to listen, watch, feel, and participate. In indigenous epistemologies, the land itself is a source of knowledge. Mountains, rivers, forests, and sacred sites are not just physical geography. They're living archives which are connected to the ancestors and memory. For instance, a migration story may be told while standing on the paths on which their ancestors walked. A ritual may be performed at a river which witnessed the historical event. Thus, the land holds memory and storytelling activates it. As many communities in India often say, the land remembers. This idea challenges the conventional belief that archives must be written or housed in institutions. For the indigenous people, the archive is ecological, spiritual, and embodied. Conventional history sees time as linear, that is, it moves steadily from the past to the present and to the future. But for the indigenous narratives, time is seen as cyclical, relational, and layered. The past is not gone. It lives in the present through the rituals, the memory, and the land. Ancestors are not distant historical figures. They are active participants in the community's life. This means that history is not only what happened, it is how we remain connected. Indigenous storytelling, therefore, does not simply recount events. It maintains relationships with ancestors, spirits, land, and community. In many of the indigenous cultures, knowledge is also not neutral. It comes with responsibility. Some stories are sacred and can be told in specific contexts. Some knowledge is restricted to the elders of particular clans. Sharing this information without permission can violate certain spiritual or cultural protocols. This also reminds us that history is not only about facts, it's about values, respect, and consent. Thus, indigenous storytelling is an ethical practice, not just an intellectual one. Finally, we also have to understand that for many indigenous communities, storytelling is not a luxury. It's a strategy for survival. When the colonial powers tried to erase their languages, ban their rituals, or impose certain new identities, the communities preserved their histories underground through songs, myths, etc., in whispered narratives. Storytelling became a way to resist erasure, to protect identity, and to assert existence. In this sense, storytelling is not only about the past, it is deeply political, profoundly cultural, and powerfully emotional. Now that we've understood the foundations of indigenous ways of knowing, we can explore more deeply how storytelling itself functions as history in these communities. Not as myth or folklore, but as a deliberate and meaningful historiographical practice. Let's see how the different forms of storytelling, such as myths, songs, genealogies, proverbs, and rituals, act as rich sources of historical knowledge. Having understood the foundations of indigenous ways of knowing, let's explore a very crucial idea: storytelling itself as a form of history. For many indigenous and oral communities, storytelling is not just a pastime or entertainment. It's a deliberate method to preserve, transmit, and interpret the past. Through their stories, communities remember where they came from, how they survived, what values they uphold, and who they are. In conventional history, myths are often dismissed as imaginary or fictional. But in the indigenous context, myths serve a very different purpose. Myths may not always record dates or events in the modern sense, but they encode origins, migrations, relationships, and cosmologies. For example, as said before, an origin myth may not only contain how the K clan came to occupy the valley, but also describe their alliances, conflicts, or ecological knowledge. The myth thus becomes a way of remembering where we belong and why we exist as a community. As historian John Van Sina notes, myths are charters of identity which justify social structures and preserve collective memory. Thus, myths do not hide history, they reveal how history is understood and lived. Another important carrier of history are songs. They're easy to memorize, emotionally expressive, and often performed in rituals, festivals, or communal gatherings. For example, war songs were sung in many communities to recall the resistance of the community against colonial authority. They're not melodies, they are emotional archives. Thus, songs are living archives which store information across generations without the need for written text. When the historian ignores songs, they ignore entire libraries of indigenous knowledge. Many indigenous communities also have the tradition of maintaining oral genealogies to trace the lineage, inheritance, and historical relationships. These genealogies go back many generations. They are carefully memorized and recited by elders or ritual specialists. They help determine land rights, clan alliances, marriage rules, and leadership roles. In some societies, genealogists also record the major historical events, migrations, conflicts, or natural disasters which are tied to specific ancestors. Genealogy, therefore, is not only social memory, it is a political and legal history. Proverbs may seem simple, but they carry a very deep historical insight. They condense moral lessons, past experiences, and collective wisdom in short, memorable phrases. For example, a proverb might reflect a past conflict with another community, the memory of a famine or flood, traditional ecological practices, or lessons on justice, courage, or cooperation. Proverbs can thus be called as microhistories, small statements that have a large memory, which reveal how the community interpreted the past experiences and transformed them in guidance for the future. In many indigenous contexts, history is not only spoken, it is also performed in the form of rituals. Rituals reenact the events from the past. Some examples include a harvest ceremony, which commemorates the first cultivation, a warrior dance, which recollects a historic battle, or a seasonal ritual, which honors ancestral migrations. In this context, the physical body becomes the text and the performance becomes the archive. So, to witness a ritual is similar to witnessing history in motion. The kind of history is embodied, sensory, and communal. It's very different from reading a document, but equally as powerful. Indigenous storytelling is also tied to specific places. For example, a hill may mark the site of an ancient settlement. A river may be remembered as a path of migration. A tree may symbolize a peace agreement between two clans. Hence, when the storyteller points to the land and says, "Our ancestors stood here," they're activating the landscape as a historical text. This means that geography itself becomes a form of memory, a map of the past which is written onto the land. Here it's important to clarify a very common misconception. Not all oral traditions are folklore. Not all folklore is unhistorical. Oral history refers to lived experiences, the personal or collective testimonies of events. It's often contemporary, based on memory, and recorded through interviews or narration. Folklore, on the other hand, include fairy tales or legends and contain symbolic or moral meanings. But it can still give us insight into the social values, historical conditions, or cultural change. As Alessandro Portelli reminds us, oral sources give us truth and meaning, even when they differ in detail. In other words, we can say that when a story is not factually precise, it reveals how the community understands its own past. And that understanding is history. In conventional history, we often separate fact from interpretation. But in indigenous storytelling, the two are inseparable. Stories do more than tell what has happened. It explains why it mattered and connected the events to values, identity, and morality. Thus, storytelling is not passive memory. It is an active interpretation of the past and is shaped by culture, experience, and emotion. What this means is storytelling is not just the source of history, it is a method of doing history. When we recognize storytelling as history, we expand our understanding of what history can be. History is not only written in books, it is sung, spoken, performed, embodied, and remembered, and is carried in the language, the land, and lineage. Storytelling gives the past live. It turns memory into meaning and gives voice to those whom conventional history has left silent. Storytelling is the heart of indigenous historiography. Now that we've understood how storytelling has functioned as a historical practice, let's compare the indigenous narratives with conventional history writing. It will help us understand that the differences in method, and also the deeper differences in their worldview, their purpose, and the power. To do this clearly, I'll highlight 5 major contrasts between conventional history and the indigenous storytelling. First, conventional history depends on written records like archives, colonial records, chronicles, government records, and literary texts. These are seen as the most reliable and objective sources. In contrast, indigenous history is preserved through oral traditions like stories, songs, rituals, proverbs, and performances. They are transmitted through memory and experience, not paper. The problem is that conventional historians treat the written word as superior and hence dismissed oral memory as unreliable. This has created a hierarchy of knowledge with literacy at the top and orality at the bottom. Second, conventional history is usually written by an individual historian who interprets the sources and claims authority over the narrative. Indigenous storytelling, however, is communal. Memory is shared, it's passed down, it's corrected and preserved by the entire community. Not one person owns the story. The community rather guards the accuracy and meaning of the story. What this means is history is not just about facts, it's about relationships and responsibility. Third, conventional history imagines time as linear. It moves from the past to the present to the future in a straight line, and events are placed on a timeline with specific dates. Indigenous narratives, on the other hand, often see time as cyclical or relational. The past is not over. It lives in the present through rituals, land, and memory, and ancestors are still a part of community life. This challenges the assumption that history must always be chronological. Rather, history can be experienced and felt, not just dated. Fourth, conventional historiography focuses on major political events. Wars, treaties, kings, administrations, and reforms are few examples. It is dominated by elite actors and state perspectives. Indigenous narratives, on the other hand, focus on everyday life, culture, ecology, spirituality, and relationships. They preserve knowledge about migration, survival, kinship, land use, and moral values. In this way, indigenous history is closer to lived reality than conventional history because it includes the voices of ordinary people. It is a bottom-up history, not top-down. Fifth, conventional history claims to be objective and neutral. It tries to present what happened without emotion. Indigenous narratives, on the other hand, accept that all history is meaningful. Stories are not told just to record the events, but to teach lessons, express identity, heal trauma, and strengthen memory. As Alessandro Portali notes, oral narratives may not always match the facts, but they reveal what the event meant to the people who experienced it. And meaning is just as important as fact. Thus, indigenous storytelling gives emotional truth, cultural truth, and experiential truth, which is often missed by conventional history. So, this comparison is not just about two different techniques, it reveals two different epistemologies, two ways of understanding our reality. While conventional history asks, is it written? Is it verifiable? Indigenous history asks, is it remembered? Is it meaningful? And does it guide the community? Conventional history seeks to document the past, while indigenous storytelling tries to live the past. While one preserves information, the other preserves identity. These differences help us to understand why indigenous narratives were often marginalized. It's not because they lacked value, but because conventional historiography could not recognize the different forms of value. To emphasize indigenous storytelling is not to reject written history, but to expand what we consider valid historical knowledge. It lets us see that history can be spoken, sung, performed, embodied, and remembered in the land. So let's explore storytelling as a form of resistance and decolonization. How the indigenous communities use the narrative to challenge power, heal trauma, and reclaim ownership of their past. It will show us that storytelling is not only historical, it is political, ethical, and liberating. It's a way to resist oppression, challenge the dominant narratives, and reclaim the right to speak. There are 5 key ways in which storytelling functions as resistance and decolonization. First, indigenous storytelling challenges the official version of history, which is created by the colonial or state institutions. Colonial archives portrayed indigenous communities as primitive, rebellious, or uncivilized, while the nationalist historians sometimes reduced these communities to the periphery or ignored their contributions altogether. But indigenous narratives give us a different story. They highlight agency, wisdom, diplomacy, and resistance. Storytelling corrects history. It exposes bias and restores dignity. Secondly, storytelling has been used as a way of strategy of survival when other forms of expression were being suppressed. The colonial administrators sometimes banned the indigenous in languages, rituals, or songs. Missionaries also discouraged their traditional beliefs. The state too imposed dominant languages and education systems. Despite these, the community continued to whisper stories at night, sing in secret, teach their children orally, and perform rituals in hidden spaces. So when writing was controlled, memory became the weapon of survival. Storytelling kept history alive when everything else was taken away. Thirdly, storytelling gives the communities a chance to represent themselves in their own voice on their own terms. Instead of being described by outsiders like scholars, administrators, or nationalists, they tell their own stories about who they are, where they come from, and what they value. It is an act of self-definition. Community says, we are not what colonial history says we are. We will define ourselves. To tell your story is to claim your existence. Fourthly, storytelling can also be a form of healing. Many of these indigenous communities have experienced violence, displacement, and cultural loss. The pain of these events is often passed down through generations. Storytelling allows communities to process trauma, express their grief, and honor their ancestors. When a grandmother tells a story of migration or a community sings about the past famine or war. They're not just finding memory, they're releasing the pain and finding strength. As Alessandro Portelli says, oral narratives provide emotional truth, which is far more powerful than official facts. Storytelling is a space of healing, remembrance, and resilience. Fifthly, indigenous storytelling is central to decolonizing history itself. To decolonize history means to question who has the authority to write history, to challenge the hierarchy where written records are seen as superior, to include the multiple voices, perspectives, and worldviews, and to treat the indigenous communities with respect and equality. L.T. Smith, in Decolonizing Methodologies, had argued that decolonization is not only political or economic, it is also intellectual and epistemological. What it requires is to rethink what counts as knowledge, who produces it, and how it is shared. When we recognize storytelling as history, we break the monopoly of the archive and open the door to plural, living, community-centered historiography. Indigenous storytelling is not passive memory. It is an active resistance which protects identity, confronts oppression, rebuilds dignity, and reclaims sovereignty over the past. Storytelling is not only about what happened, it's also about who gets to say what happened. And that is the heart of power. To control history is to control identity. And to reclaim history is to reclaim freedom. Up to this point, we've understood the power of indigenous storytelling and how it preserves history, identity, and resistance. So let's see how historians have been able to integrate indigenous narratives in academic research, how they have done this ethically and respectfully, and how indigenous voices can reshape the future of historiography and lead us towards a more inclusive, collaborative, and community-driven approach to history. It's not enough to simply collect stories and insert them in the existing framework. We have to rethink our methods, our ethics, and our relationships in writing history. To understand this better, let's look at 5 key approaches which help integrate indigenous narratives into historiography in a respectful and meaningful way. Firstly, historians have to recognize that oral accounts are legitimate sources of history. They're not secondary or inferior to written documents. Scholars like John Van Sina, Paul Thompson, and Alessandro Portelli have shown that oral testimonies have revealed perspectives, emotions, and memories which archives do not record. What this means is, when an elder recounts migration, a community sings a war song, we listen not as folklore collectors, but as historians of lived experience. We have to read and hear these oral narratives with the same seriousness as we read written texts. Secondly, integrating indigenous narratives require both rigor and respect. Historians have to conduct in-depth interviews or ethnographic observations. They have to cross-check the narratives with other sources like oral, material, or ecological. They have to understand the cultural context of the story and recognize the metaphor and symbolism, not just the literal meaning. Say, for example, a myth about a river drying up may actually reflect a historical drought or migration. Thus, interpretation must be empathetic, nuanced, and culturally informed. These indigenous narratives are rich, but only if we know how to listen properly. Thirdly, historians have to move from researching on communities to researching with the communities. What this means is the researchers have to involve the members of the community in the research process, seek the consent and guidance from the elders and storytellers of the community, respect who has the right to tell certain stories, and also allow the community to shape the narrative and its interpretation. The goal is not to extract the stories, but to build a relationship which is based on trust, reciprocity, and co-authorship. History becomes stronger when it is produced together. Fourthly, integrating these indigenous narratives also requires certain strong ethical practices. We have to ask who owns the story, who benefits from its recording or publication. Can all stories be made public, or are some sacred or restricted? And will the community have access to the final work? And are we giving credit and recognition to the storytellers? As Linda T. Smith argues, decolonizing research requires us to respect indigenous sovereignty over knowledge. History must not exploit, it must honor. Fifthly, we have to expand what we consider historical source. The indigenous history lives in various forms like songs, rituals, landscapes, dance, genealogies, and place names, and even in the silences and pauses which are observed in storytelling. The archive is not only a building full of bond documents, it can be a forest, a mountain, a festival, even a living body. So, as the saying goes, in many indigenous cultures, land is our archive and the people are our library. So, when we expand the meaning of sources and archives, we have to open the door to truly inclusive historiography. When historians integrate these indigenous narratives with respect and rigor, several powerful things happen. History becomes more accurate as it includes multiple perspectives. History becomes democratic because it gives voice to the marginalized. History becomes interdisciplinary, drawing on various disciplines like anthropology, ecology, linguistics, and spirituality. And history becomes more human, capturing emotion, memory, and identity. However, most importantly, it allows communities to see themselves in history. History is no longer something written about them, it's something written with them. Integrating these indigenous narratives is not just an academic correction, it's a transformation which challenges the very foundation of how we think about the past. Instead of one history, we have to accept many histories, many truths, and many ways of remembering the past. Instead of privileging the written word, we have to value voice, experience, and relationship. And instead of separating fact from meaning, we have to recognize that both are essential to understand our past. This will lead us towards creating a plural, decolonized, and community-centered historiography which honors both knowledge and the people who carry it. As we come to the end of this session on emphasizing indigenous narratives and storytelling, let's reflect on the key insights we have uncovered. We studied that storytelling in indigenous societies is not only cultural or entertaining, it's a historical act which preserves memory, identity, and values. It connects the people to their ancestors, land, and community. We explored how the indigenous ways of knowing differ from conventional history in profound ways. And these differences remind us that the multiple ways of understanding and recording the past. We also examined how storytelling functions as a sophisticated form of historiography through various means like myths, songs, oral genealogies, clan histories, proverbs, rituals, and landscapes which hold this memory in place. We saw that storytelling is not only preservation, it's resistance as well, which challenges the colonial and nationalist misrepresentations. It protects the identity when languages and rituals are threatened and gives the community power to speak for themselves. It heals the collective trauma and asserts sovereignty over memory. We discussed how historians can respectfully and rigorously integrate indigenous narratives into academic history by treating these testimonies as valid evidence, understanding the cultural context and symbolism, collaborating with the communities, following the ethical responsibility, and expanding the very definition of sources and archives. Emphasizing indigenous storytelling is not about replacing written history. It's about expanding history. It's about understanding that our past also lives in words, songs, land, landscape, ritual, performances, memory and emotion, silences and survival. History is not only what is written in books. history is also what is remembered in hearts. When we listen to indigenous narratives, we do more than enrich our knowledge. We restore dignity, we honor identity, we decolonize memory. We allow history to speak in many voices, not just one. Thank you.